Okay, I'm Pam Price, Professor Emerita from University of Oslo. The first panel is called Interventions 1, Democratic Origins. And this panel focuses on what might be called the origins of Indian democracy, or more specifically, the origins of Indian democracy in the nationalist struggle and other subaltern struggles in the first half of the 20th century. The first speaker, each person has 20 minutes to present, is Sandipto Dasgupta.
Thank you. Oops. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Alf, Kenneth, and Anand for organizing this, for having us here. I was speaking to Alf yesterday, and he said for the very beginning panel, he did want us to give a sense, or at least me to give a sense in my paper about the beginnings of, or the moments of foundation, let's speak. But given that, I think the theme of the conference, as Alf sort of laid out, also tries to interrogate some of the questions facing us today, 70 years hence that founding. I'll try to make some points, more sort of speculative points, I guess, at the very end about how some of the things I'm talking about might help us understand the current moment we are in. So my work in general is about sort of a theory and history of Indian constitutionalism. I'm just going to talk about two themes I thought it would be of interest to people at this conference, and make a few sort of, a few points, which comes from the way I sort of read the Indian Constitutional Assembly debates, because often when we talk about constitution in India today, and also often constitutionalism the world over, we sort of think of constitution as some kind of a liberal coda, sort of a limit set on the state at the very beginning. There's a sort of consensus on that, and then it's sort of those limits are interrogated often almost exclusively through court cases, with judges, interpretation. And it's a very legalistic and a sort of a liberal legalistic way of thinking about constitutions, which is a very dominant framework in which we understand constitutions, even in India, right? So in India, often the writings on constitution talk about as if there are these very stable set of sort of foundational consensus we came out of the freedom struggle with, and anything we are doing in now not in adherence to those limits are a violation of the sort of this social contract version of what our struggle meant. I read the constitutional debates and constitutional a little differently, and I think there's a reason it's an argument I want to make that it is not necessarily either a liberal constitutional framework, which the constitution makers came up with, neither was it actually something of the nature of there has been this sort of revolutionary upheaval, we come with a new consensus, which we then institutionalize in this thing called the constitution. I think that's the kind of interesting starting point, the point being that in India, there actually was no such a revolutionary consensus, sort of a broad common sense, I would argue, as to what the nature of state and society or the political and social order should be. What I mean by that is, and if there's this classical model of, you can think of the French Revolution being one where the revolutionaries come in, they storm the Bastille, they have their new sort of, imagination, which the Constitution then reflects, right? And if you read the kind of the writings of the Congress in the last years of just basically after quitting the movement, when it's kind of very clear that they are the party of government in waiting, basically, no longer a party just of anti-colonial movement. As well as in the assembly, they think of the word revolution very differently, right? And there are actually lots of interesting. Nehru has this long quote where I like that he said that people always tend to think of revolution as this upheaval and bloodshed and sort of breaking things and making new things. But I really think revolution is about changing the way people live, getting them food, getting them housing, building industries, right? And you already see these two ideas of revolution, which is very much actually a 20th century idea of these two notions of revolution. On one hand, this idea of revolution as just completely, new beginnings, de novo, out of kind of a bloody struggle. And other revolution is this planned change for betterment of society, often pretty technical in the sense of requiring particular skills and expertise to make society go in a certain direction. Modernization is often the name for this sort of idea. And it's a second model of revolution, which the Constitution talk about. What that means is that revolution is no longer a past event which we have left behind, for which the Constitution now is the result of, right? That's the way the American founders talk about the revolution. It's a past event, the rupture which happened, but something now we need to do in the future. Right? And to do that in the future, this is the very critical part for them, need to do it in the future through this thing called the Constitution. Right? So Constitution no longer about this stable set of orders and limits we can't overcome, but a complex process through which we can make this massive transformation in society. Right? And there's a couple of things which sort of, and what I want to say, I'm sort of really jumping through a lot of steps in between which one can go, but the outcome of all of this way of thinking about revolution constitution is that what you have in India is not so much what we can call this liberal social contractual version of constitution, but what we can call an administrative version of constitution. And what does that mean? It means basically, if you can sort of think of the middle of 19th century, a whole host of techniques and expertise and capabilities of the states were developed, both in the West, in response to industrialization and sort of complex process of working class mobilization, social question, urbanization, as well as in the colonies to manage an unruly, unknown population. Right? And this is what calls this administrative state, administrative techniques, administrative law, which sort of governs this, how this particular bodies function, as opposed to constitutional law, right? Which is about sort of sovereign people being the foundation of the society. And it is this mentality, this kind of way of thinking about things, which is reflected in Indian constitution making, rather than the revolutionary way of thinking about things, which often reflect that people think in constitution making. And you can think of this in terms of risk calculation. A lot of, Indian constitution is one of the few ones where they actually had an in-house lawyer, as we can call it, AKIR, who basically said, well, if they have this provision, this is how it might turn out in court cases later on. You have things like comparative expertise. So B.N. Rao went across the world trying to understand, okay, they have this provision, these guys have this provision, this works that way, this is what they learn from it. Think about this is not a revolutionary, how not revolutionaries functions, right? Revolutionaries function, this is what our new vision is. Not like, let's look at Ireland and look at the United States, let's look at Weimar Germany and find the best machine parts, let's say, by which we can build this new machine we need. Right. But, sorry. And what it also, this administrative, another important thing about this means is that there is a certain kind of coherence which comes from this, right? It's not sort of contending political visions fighting out in the Constituent Assembly, but I think some of the most important figures in Constituent Assembly were not necessarily ones which had sweeping political visions. AKIR, I mentioned, the lawyer from Madras Presidency was one. B.N. Rao, I think, who is perhaps one of the most important figures in the Constitution, was a civil servant all his life, and that was because he knew how the machine worked. Those were the really prized people in understanding how we can create this thing. And this is also why the Indian Constitution is the longest constitution in the world, because you need a very detailed manual. It's not about some simple principles, right? But there's two things I want to say about, so there's a lot of interesting, I think, things which come out if you try to read the Constitution in this way, an administrative way rather than this revolutionary liberal way. But there's 2 points I want to make for our purpose. One is that this actually leads to, I think, another idea of the Constitution being a socialist or social democratic tract, which has also some purchase. You can see why that's not the case, because kind of a socialist vision would also have certain sort of foundational principles which you will then want to. The issue here is not about laying down certain foundational principles by which our society or parts will function, but finding precise ways of management and techniques of management, right? So in some sense, the underlying ideological basis is sort of open for negotiation through this process. The real commitment is the process of management, right? I will say a bit more of what I mean by that in a second. But the second thing I really want to stress on for this thing is that what this gives us is a new idea of what the people are, right? Because every constitution has this sort of term taken from the American Constitution beginning, that we, the people, are the authors and creators of this Constitution Pact. Now, everybody knows this is an old point in political and constitutional theory that people are always a fictitious entity brought into being by this very act of being the author. That's not an interesting point. But the interesting point is what kind of fiction are they, right? And all throughout, 18th and 19th century, the people, there was something, you can say either people speak through the revolutionary moment by which they affirm a new principle, a new sort of, new sort of visions of political and social order, new common sense, which the Constitution reflects. That's how the people speak in some sense. The other way the people also speak is because, by actual sort of this political parties. So one of the major constitutional battles across 19th century was that of extension of franchisee. So actually make the people, with a capital P, more and more analogous to the actual people by extending the franchise and rights of participation, right? Both of those are not the case in India. A, we didn't have the revolution of that kind, as we just noted. The second is there's already a universal franchise at the very beginning. This actually changes pretty much everything about the constitutional form, right? Because now you're dealing with, this not, the people are actually this whole swath of masses of whom, there's, as the constitution makers again and again say, they're not trained in the art of democracy. They have little faith in terms of their ability, in some sense, to sort of make sense of this complex process needed for development and mature sort of democratic bargaining and so on. So what the people actually, the way the people are perceived, and this is something was one of the most interesting discoveries for me when you read the constitutional debates sort of, between the lines, so to speak, is there's this overwhelming sense of anxiety about the people as this sort of unknown amorphous mass outside. And they keep talking about the masses, that's a term they keep using, and they use particular terms, the naked masses, the starving masses, right? Who are, they are not patient. So there's a sense of this, some kind of, disturbing sea out there. These are not people who have political parties we can negotiate with, representatives of, you can name, okay, there are 3 groups, let's have a kind of, round table. But there is this source of anxiety and tension and instability which is out there. And there's of course, some very concrete reasons for that. If you look at the period just leading up to the assembly and during the assembly, I was talking to Sunil about this, the Telangana revolt is happening while they're in the assembly. They keep talking about that. It's the largest peasant struggle in India, even till date, armed peasant struggle. There are several such peasant struggles of much smaller scale in Telangana across India at that time. There are 2 massive strikes in Bombay and Calcutta just about a few years ago. And there's a sense that these are people we don't fully grasp yet. They don't know. They don't always speak our same language yet. And there's all this thing. They talk about the dangers of bloodshed and insurrection. They talk about the process will break if we can't bend. And Nehru famously said that if we can't do the revolution in here, namely the Constitutional Assembly, the revolution will happen out there, and we won't have a say as to how it happens. Right. And I think it's some of the openness of the Constitution, some of the kind of the way you can't really lay down, okay, this is property and inviolable, these are certain things inviolable, precisely because it's throbbing on anxiety. And in some ways, we want to think about, this is another point I want to make about the present moment, in the way the people or the popular movements can enter the assembly. It actually originally did enter the assembly, the Constitutional Assembly, not in the form of representatives or parties, not in the form of certain kinds of, sort of clear-cut 10-point agenda which certain groups sent, but as this sort of specter of revolution outside, right? Pushing, therefore, the constitution makers to be much more responsive to certain kind of changes inside. Okay, I have about 10 minutes more. Yeah?
Actually, more like 7, 8.
Okay, all right. So I'll move to my second point, then I will not belabor this first point. The second point is one other aspect of the Constitution we'll talk about, sort of linking up to this, is the idea of parliamentarism. I think the fact that India became a parliamentary democracy is often, it's not often written about that much as say, like fundamental rights or directive principles, partly because people think it's an obvious thing. Britain was parliamentary, and often former colonies follow their colonizers' paths, and that's what happened. But actually, there's a very interesting set of debates as to why parliamentary democracy. And if you think about it, the reason it's interesting is because if you think about it, if you want to have this sort of mass transformative agenda, pretty much all the countries which went for that did it under a pretty strong unified executive. You can think of Bismarck's Germany. You can think of the Mexican Constitution in 1917, which had this huge social rights agenda, had a presidential form. You can think of New Deal America, which became more and more presidential and executive driven, because the point is if you need this expertise and technocracy, it's done best under this sort of unified structure of a president. So if that's what Indians did want, actually, it's actually counterintuitive that you went for a parliamentary process, right? And there's some pretty interesting debates as to why parliamentarism, not presidentialism, in the Constitutional Assembly. And this is kind of important for us because I think there is more and more, I feel, in the public sphere, and it's been there for a while, of this sort of, what I could call it, the China envy amongst the Indian elites of, they have this pretty strong unified executive who can get things done, and ours is this messy process. And an argument for presidentialism in India. You can see this again and again in much popular forums, why we need a presidential form. And I think this is important to understand what was the choices made at that point, right? And so the first thing is that the constitution maker said that there's this myth that presidentialism is more efficient. And their argument was that this is actually not the case in the case of India. Because if you understand efficiency in a presidential system is if there was actually an emergency and something needed to be done, and we know what needs to be done, it's good to have this one guy who gets this done, right? Here, we are committed to rather a process of this management of this extraordinarily complex set of contending interests. And that happens best when you have a forum where these interests can actually negotiate and the state can be responsive, as Ambedkar said, in a daily basis. The minister has to answer to the parliament every day. The president only goes for election every 5 years. Right? And so there's a kind of way in which this administrative machinery you build is sort of responsive to these different factions almost on a daily basis, and they kind of shift courses away. They calculate differently, right? Rather than sort of going in. But there's another, the second part to this point, which is that to get your voices heard in a parliamentary system, the mobilization is necessarily pretty low key. You need to sort of lobby your MP, form a small party, get a few votes, create coalitions, right? In presidential system, to hear your voice, it's not low key. It's a nationwide, often extra constitutional mass mobilization, precisely the kind of things they want to avoid, right? So they want to, and so the parliamentarism also has a pedagogic function for them in terms of how to train the masses into democracy. Don't tell them that the only way they can get things done is by this one great leader, and you have to have this massive mass mobilization. But through this sort of multiple small negotiation, right? There's a pedagogic sort of element of teach them bargaining, teach them compromise, right? Teach them how to sort of build coalition, and that's what parliamentarism does. It sort of teaches, and this is why there's a very interesting debate as to why not have a presidential election. Okay, the president has no actual power, fine, but why isn't he elected? And the reason they give is that you don't want the president to ever to be able to claim that kind of legitimacy. You never want to create a sort of forum, right, where that sort of a debate happens about, what is this national level, And this also tells you what exactly was going to happen with Indira Gandhi. What she did was precisely the kind of things was worrying for the constitution makers, this sort of, an extra constitutional mobilization, right, at the fundamental level. So I'll just make the last sort of point on this, if I have a couple of minutes, which is, again, what does it mean, the parliamentary thing for us in some sense? I think the interesting thing with the parliamentary thing is that it just shows, and this is, and there's a lot of writings, Tocqueville, Marx, very different figures, always thought that parliamentarism is a sign of a more confident bourgeoisie. Right, because you're happy to have your state being open to this sort of everyday mass franchise moment, everyday sort of negotiations, and Congress has that confidence. They know they can at least the first 10 years at least they can get that enough votes and kind of manage that negotiation process. Now, once that starts fracturing, the question becomes more interesting. And I still feel, I think, this sort of opening it up, this process of the administrative state to kind of a parliamentary scrutiny and responsiveness in the way they did, precisely because that will make it more stable and more efficient in a certain sense, counterintuitively. It also gives a new form of, new possibilities for oppositional politics, right? So I think there's two things I want to sort of end with. The first, the importance of this extra constitutional anxiety, right? That's been always the way in which the masses have made their voices heard in some sense vis-a-vis the elites. Because remember, the constitution makers were not chosen by direct election. We sometimes forget how important that fact could be. They came in, as Ambedkar said, because of his wisdom and knowledge. And so these are sort of technocratic figures. And the technocrats only hear the noise outside because they're not really, There's not ways in the masses have these ways inside, otherwise from making the noise outside. So I think that's one important sort of political thing vis-a-vis the constitution process, and how it's not, I think at least, not through court cases and not through these sort of, expert committees in which we sometimes think the big social movements sort of can be heard. That's one point. And the second point, this is all made very in a sketchy way. We can talk about it more in the direction. The second point is the fact that the parliament system sort of opens the process up as opposed to the presidential form of needing this extra constitutional mobility. Once that coherence of the elite project with the Congress sort of passes away, which it did sort of post-70s, I think the parliamentary process, or democratic process, or using the constitutional form as a as a form of democratization, opening up voices through the parliament, has been, to the extent it has been, much more promising. And I think that's the path where it's much more promising even today, as opposed to the more sort of technocratic, legalistic ways in which constitutional negotiations often happen in India. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Anupama Rao from Barnard College in the U.S. And the title of her talk is Conversion, Constitution, Revolution, Keywords for Thinking History and Democracy.
I'm not sure I can, okay. So I think actually my comments will follow well on Sandipto's in terms of maybe taking us back to the moment before constitutionalism, as it were, and to ask some questions about precisely the kinds of categories that he brings to the fore, especially the question of the people and who constitute the people. So in the brief time I have, and in case I have to rush through something very quickly, I want to sort of start with a few things that I take for granted in the comments I'm going to make. The first thing is that caste's 20th century history is also a history of Indian democracy. And I think the Muslim question actually, Pasmanda politics, as well as what's happening today with Dalit and Muslim lynchings, actually suggest a process of kind of religious difference becoming caste, if you will. And this may be something we can think and talk about. The second, of course, is the figure of Ambedkar, who will come in and out of my comments. But this remarkable fact that he is forgotten for 50 years and then reemerges in some sense as our most important critic, interlocutor, and indeed insurgent thinker. The second point, or the kind of question that I'm taking for granted, is that the issue of religion and economy in some ways stand outside and put pressure on the political as we know it, and that these become issues leading up to the moment of constitutionalism, that these become issues that have to find commensuration or equivalence in terms that are not their own, and that we need to think about them through categories of difference and equality or inequality, and indeed the question of minority. And so what I want to think about is a prehistory of how these broad universal categories, religion, economy, and indeed politics and rights, the liberal constitutional moment, are categories that undergo a set of experiments, how they're repurposed under conditions of imperial capitalism. So my terms, revolution, conversion, and I'll end with constitution, I want to see as so many modalities of response to the question of what stands before or outside the political. And so to get us to this moment of constitution, I want to do two things. One is to think about capital as a transformative force in the interwar, especially, and then how this actually reprises the question of minority and of religious difference and inequality. And then just something about my method. I want to think about modes of abstraction and de-abstraction. You will see this in the comments that I'm going to make. And so this is also, to my mind, a way of challenging kind of intellectual history or political thought and the ways in which we have seen this period being described or discussed. Okay. So following the conceptual impasse of liberalism and the end of communism, a group of political philosophers and social theorists have been concerned with how history might intersect with theory to reanimate or revivify conceptions of the political. For them, the relationship between the experience of social marginality and trajectories of political enfranchisement or visibility cannot be explained through the normative language of political philosophy, which typically considers questions of freedom, liberty, sovereignty, and morality, without also attending to the material conditions, the relations of production as also social relations, and the question of agonism within the domain of the social. Thus, Judith Butler asks what happens when the universal is wielded precisely by those who signify its contamination, by those socially excluded and marginalized. Is it possible that conventional and exclusionary norms of universality can, through perverse reiteration, produce unconventional formulations of universality that expose the limited and exclusionary features of universality itself, even as they mobilize new demands? We might think with Butler in recalling figures that have claimed the place of the universal by challenging the primacy of labor universalism in standard Marxist accounts of political subject formation. Jacques Rancière speaks of philosophy's discomfort with the figure of the poor as an illustration of philosophy's discomfort with the concrete as such. In other writings, such as Knights of Labor, Rancière criticizes the assumption that the divide between intellectual and manual labor is real. Indeed, Rancière is at some pains to indict something like an inequality of imagination that is produced when thinkers engage in the fallacy of associating the capacity for thought with the sociological conception of status and location, thereby assuming that material destitution contains mass intellectuality. More recently, Frank Ruda has argued that poverty is the unthought in Hegel's philosophy and focused on the transformations of the poor into rabble in Hegel's philosophy of right. Or the literary theorist Peter Stalibras has argued that we revisit the figures of the lumpen proletariat to see how Marx conceives them as a sartorial category of visible multitude. Fanon instead argued, as we remember, that the lumpen proletariat was one of the most spontaneous and radically revolutionary forces of a colonized people. And then there are the minority identities, Negro, Dalit, Muslim, Jew, which gained salience in the interwar in the context of imperial transition and nation-state formation. A history of minority is also a history of the 20th century is waiting to be written, and I'll come back to this when I end with Ambedkar. But for now, the inventory that I've offered above is meant to bring into view figures whose concrete particularity troubles the constitution of the social whole, and whose politicality, that is, the conditions under which their actions might be viewed as properly political, must be established rather than assumed. Commensuration and historical comparison play a crucial role here. For instance, Ambedkar's conception of the Dalit as a figure of political potentiality would not have been possible without historical comparison. It is through acts of commensuration between caste and race, and later between caste and class, that caste came to be viewed as a historically determined form of quite general processes of inequality and subordination. Thus, if anti-colonials and social reformers had provincialized caste as an intensely local form of hierarchy that offered little scope for comparison elsewhere, anti-caste thinkers drew on historical comparison between caste and other forms of inequality. Indeed, they made equality thinkable by describing inequality. And the basic point that I want to make here is that it is through the process of historical comparison, indeed globalizing, and in a sense thinking through figures of dispossession, that it is possible to think equality at all in this time. This stands in contrast, of course, with the politics of that time, but it also poses that as anti-colonial nationalism. But it also poses a challenge for contemporary scholarship on caste, which has challenged representations of caste as a form of non-political difference and a manifestation of hierarchy contra North Atlantic conceptions of equality, and has done so by historicizing caste's social pertinence and analytic centrality as a form of subcontinental difference. So how to deprovincialize caste in order to think about its place in globally ramified conversations about equality, inequality. So this is, in a sense, the first set of moves of kind of globalizing these categories, if you will, before we can think about specific forms of political redress, which brings us to the moment of constitution and the kinds of points that Sandipto was making, it seems to me. So how to think difference and equality, exception and universality together. These terms structure the terrain of contemporary politics in India, and they characterize the nature of its constitutional democracy. Their relevance for contemporary conversations about new alliances between Dalit and Muslim, and between Ambedkarites and the left, which are sort of important conversations happening today, is obvious, but I hope we can talk about them in our collective discussions over the next couple of days. So what I very briefly want to do is to think through these figures of dispossession and the ways in which imperial capitalism and the question of caste and class actually get constellated. And this is my keyword, revolution, or to think about or to rethink the question of labor in the context of Indian specificity, if you will. And I'll try to do that with the question of religion as well, and then bring us to the Constitution. So in terms of figures of dispossession, I want to take us back to the late 19th century and to think about the fact, and I'm thinking through figures in Maharashtra, Phule in particular, but just to note that anti-caste activists had contended for long that jati bhed, caste divisions, were not merely a social arrangement, but a mode of thought. Indeed, a social abstraction along the lines of the property-personhood relationship that had been instituted by classical liberalism. Phule, for instance, argues that the Shudra Atishudras were denied access to critical thought and uses the metaphor of stamping, imprinting, or a weight sitting on the head to compare Brahminical dominance with intellectual enslavement. So my question is also, how does thought think itself under these conditions? And in turn, he advocates a radical empiricism as a form of immanent critique. Naming and description were key to Satyashodh, to truth-seeking, and they were themselves practices of intellectual emancipation that focalized the experience of injustice and indifference through resonant imagery. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples. And I want to suggest that it is indeed this kind of mode of both de-abstracting and abstracting that allows us to rethink and to make class useful, as it were, for Indian conditions. So it's merely that kind of an exercise here. Jairus Banerjee's classic study of the Deccan moneylender, and I just want to take us to the Deccan famine for a second, addresses the centrality of debt and rent-seeking to the colonial economy, and does so by making an important intervention in the Marxist transition debate, challenging the telos that underlies the distinction between real and formal subsumption. His exhaustive study of the impact of the commodification of agriculture on the 19th century Deccan suggests the subjugation of the Indian peasantry to the usury capital of Marwadi and Gujarati merchants, and a nascent capitalist class emerging in the Deccan, among the Deccan peasantry. Banerjee argues that essentially peasant indebtedness to local moneylenders had alienated them from the means of production, and it could be argued that, like the industrial proletariat, the peasant too was now working for a wage. In essence, agrarian indebtedness, rather than a sign of backwardness, was the historically specific mode by which the peasant receives a wage for his reproduction, whether in the form of an advance on the crop to be delivered or as a share of the crop. In essence, the peasant has become dependent on the capitalist. He is a worker. Phule describes exactly this world in his time, and describes this world of peasant struggle and survival in vivid detail. His writings, too, recognize that modern transformations of caste carry the potential for immanent critique. In Gulamgiri, slavery, he notes that the Indian peasant has been the proverbial milch cow. Those who successively held sway over him cared only to fatten themselves on the sweat of his brow without caring for his welfare or condition. It was sufficient for their purpose that they could held him safe in their clutches, for squeezing out of him as much as they possibly could. Phule goes on to link agrarian distress with various states of transient and impoverished existence. And he goes on to note the situation of vagrancy, working for wages in a big city, and so on and so forth. And indeed, what I want to merely suggest here is that in Phule's writing, what we see is a rich, resonant world of description, a description of the agrarian sensorium that is in itself a work of radical empiricism that seeks to describe a social totality from the perspective of the exploited and the victimized. And indeed, Phule does this by describing a world of routinized deprivation with attention to figures that embody impoverishment and vulnerability. I won't go into all of the details here, but merely to ask you to take my point here, that what we begin to see here is a profusion of a set of descriptions of dispossession, of vagrancy, and indeed of exploitation that becomes extremely important later for Marxist critique, that it is indeed this kind of anti-caste moment that produces figures and figurations of dispossession that Marxists then take up. And so let me switch quickly to the moment when we actually see sort of Marxism in the world. And I'm drawing here also on the kinds of arguments that Harry Harootunian has made in Marx After Marx, which is to suggest that there is a moment of Eastern or early Marxism, a kind of heterodox Marxism that actually tries to think through grounded specificity. It actually works through the kinds of figures of dispossession and figurations of inequality that I'm trying to suggest here. And that indeed, for our purposes today, we may also want to think about the infusion of that early Marxism by a kind of ethical Islam. So, what is it that actually produces and creates a kind of heterodox early Marxism in India, which becomes so important, indeed, for many of these anti-caste theorists? We will get to Ambedkar. But I want to kind of use the figures that Phule draws our attention to and bring us forward, in a sense, to the moment where there's an effort to translate Marx into Marathi. The standard translation of Capital appeared in Maharashtra in the 1960s. However, it's Ambedkar's newspaper, Janata, that had reprinted translations of Wage, Labor, and Capital in the 30s, and had translated these from communist pamphlets. Janata also published Soviet social realism in serialized form, and I think across India, Gorky's Mother, which is translated, attains a kind of iconic status as standing in for not just social realist figurations of exploitation, but indeed as people's, I think, encounter with Marx and Marxism. Right? And so, and I think it's very interesting that it is indeed Ambedkar who, with the formation of the Independent Labour Party, is already beginning to think about caste class as a kind of new formation and figuration, right? That indeed class has to be thought through the figurations of class. So the translation of the Communist Manifesto by Berlin-returned Gangadhar Adhikari happens in 1931. Adhikari himself, of course, as you know, studies in Berlin, comes under the influence of prominent Indian Marxists, and returns and translates the Jahirnama in 1931. This is, in a sense, the only effort in this period to begin to think through local or social specificity. All of the other publications of the Communist Party at this time are about the Paris Commune, about Lenin's life, the Russian Revolution, and so on and so forth, deeply distanced in some sense from social reality. It's in the Jahirnama that class is made legible as a new form of political collectivity through association with existing forms of social experience. Terms such as kashta, hard work, daridrita, impoverishment or destitution, bekar, the unemployed and the worthless, bhuke kangal, pauperized, and association with social forms such as the degraded Dalit Varga or Dalit classes, Pathans, associated with the flesh trade and money lending, and other parasitical activities, and the Mavali associated with the communities of the hilly Sahyadri mountain range, with banditry and guerrilla warfare, all begin to make an appearance in the Jahirnama. Each of these are imprecisely identified with class, and they constituted something like an excessively dispossessed multitude, visually identifiable rather than class specifiable, going back and thinking about your starving masses and the description of a kind of multitude that actually is visible but can't quite be made, it's very difficult to describe them specifically. So what you have here is a set of visual descriptions, and the power of these forms of life was precisely this, to connote and conjure intimacy with the emergent category of class. That is to say, labor was both underspecified and over-described. We see here a process of de-abstraction and concretization in the Jahirnama, exploitation rendered visible through everyday language, and personified in figures of predation. This act of naming could cut both ways. It called up existing forms of life on their own terms, and by placing them besides each other, forced novel associations between them. So these efforts, in a sense, at commensuration and creating equivalence. Labor was not the sum of its parts, rather naming the difference of labor was also an act of enframing that brought multiple constituencies together as a political force and ethical community. This indeed ought to be seen as a prelude to Dalit writing by writers such as Baburao Bagul and the Dalit Panthers later, who indeed saw social description and poetic speech as one and the same, and as one of the most important forms of critique. That is, figures who sought to instantiate equality in the everyday. Thus, if one were to ask what Marxism or ideas of revolution, class struggle, and so on and so forth meant in this period, how its potential for social and political emancipation was understood, the brief point that I'm making is this, that we could argue, as Andrew Sartori recently argues with regard to Lockeanism, that the thought did not strictly correlate with the writings of a thinker by that name or the numerous scholarly interpretations of Marx's work. Rather, Marxism had already become a powerful mode of thought because it called up earlier images of destitution and dispossession that had long association with anti-caste thought, but which were now redefined through the availability of labor as a concept. In other words, a set of cosmopolitan aspirations and connections preceded the substance of the intellectual links that Dalits tried to establish and remained a placeholder for a politics to come. Ironically, it is at this juncture that this kind of everyday heterodox Marxism also confronts the limits of thinking through the politicality of labor, through the figure, let's say, of Ambedkar. So we see that thinking about equality through the economy was powerful. It had the capacity to suggest equivalence across difference by using the Marxist understanding of labor time as common measure, much as money had functioned as the universal equivalent for liberalism. Yet difference remained, and this is something that Ambedkar constantly reminds us, between the manual scavenger, the beggar, the Pathan moneylender, and the Kunbi laborer. Body history, the corporeal life of labor, resisted full conversion. Ambedkar argued that the state, as mediator, arbitrator, or enforcer of law, played a critical role in socialism and communism by prioritizing economic equivalence and conceiving politics along the lines of class war and revolution. What was the relationship between the idea of equality and equivalence? Was the latter a route for making the idea of equality present or imminent? Or was Marxism fated to remain a critique of inequality without being able also to think the forms of mutuality that Buddhism promised? And we can discuss the long arc of Ambedkar's relationship with Marx, but I'll sort of bring us towards the end to speed along towards my conclusion too. Ambedkar's return to spirituality was the last great expressive act of his life in the form of a new Buddhism, fashioned as a religion of equality. Buddhist conversion was preceded by Ambedkar's argument that the history of religion was a history of revolution. Religion is a constantly changing entity that eventually succumbed to counter-revolutionary force. Religion showed a movement in his writings on the philosophy of Hinduism from a concern with basic human existence, disease, death, survival, to organization around competing lineages and politics, and finally the insertion of morality into religion. And in many ways, one could read Ambedkar and someone like Kosambi side by side, because both of them, in a sense, are thinking about the history of state as also a history of religion. And I think it's quite remarkable to engage in this. So in the way that someone like Kosambi will think about bhakti and feudalism, we have Ambedkar trying to do similar things with organized Hinduism and Puranic Hinduism, and its response to the challenge of Buddhism. So organized Hinduism accompanied the development of political society. It was a political theology, one might say, where religion existed as law. Ambedkar's response was to return to the ground of religion itself and to activate the historical memory of Buddhism's disappearance in the very land of its birth. Ambedkar's reclamation of Buddhism as an agonistic historical force reverberates well beyond the immediate moment of conversion, his own, and the 600,000 Dalits who converted less than 2 months before he died. If Hindus refused to make amends to the former untouchable, the latter's conversion to another world religion could change the equation. Buddhism was coeval in status with Hinduism, but superior to it in form and substance. Right? And indeed, it was no religion at all. Its absence in India was not only proof of Brahminical Hinduism's violence, but Buddhism was an Indic religion whose authority no one could dare challenge. This epistemic space that Ambedkar claimed was thus ingenious and unassailable. But the Navayana Buddhism that he established was, in effect, as I said, a godless religion, not legible to extant traditions. So Ambedkar's answer was not only to offer a more intensively conceived form of universality, right, the response, one could almost say, to the engagement with Marx. So this was not only a more intensively conceived form of universality in the ethical universe of Buddhism, it also underscored the singular circumstance of his response. What he had managed to do was to restage caste difference as a religious difference that was both familiar and new. That is, as a conversation that one assumed had already occurred in the millennial past, but the contents of which were in fact to be decided in the future to come. I'm going to take 2 more minutes and conclude, if you will allow me 2 extra minutes. So this brings us, in a sense, to the moment of constitution itself as a conversion. And just recall that I've suggested, in a sense, that the economy and spirituality, religion and politics stand outside the question of the political, but indeed become absolutely essential to it and have to be managed by politics, as it were, by converting those categories into categories of difference and inequality. Right? Ambedkar participates in a debate on the 3rd draft of the Indian Constitution on November 25th, 1949. Alf has already mentioned the first part of Ambedkar's statement about the contradictions of political democracy and social inequality. Ambedkar goes on to argue that he and his generation had done their best to make a good constitution through recourse to a grand exercise in comparative constitutionalism. Yet nothing could be settled by the Constitution, given the enormity of its brief: to inaugurate a political democracy by eradicating caste, a millennial order of injustice and inequality. And of course, we have to remember that not only is Telangana and a number of other, and strike action and so forth happening in the moment of the Constituent Assembly, partition is happening too, right? And this produces, it seems to me, a very important moment of rupture in thinking about the question of religious difference and caste, thinking the Dalit and the Muslim both together and separately. So Ambedkar goes on to argue, the reluctant constitutionalist that he is, and he goes on to reject the founding document that he's birthed and argues, I'm quite prepared to say that I'll be the first person to burn the Constitution. If our people want to carry on, they must remember that the majorities cannot ignore the minorities by saying, oh no, to recognize you is to harm democracy. So this question of the history of minority is the history of the 20th century in some sense that I began with. How do we think about this question of minority? How is it figured in Ambedkar? Ambedkar's reluctance reflects both his commitment to the skepticism of programs and policies instituted to produce social equality, and instead draws attention to the gap between legislated redress and existential suffering, and between the founding document and the equality it imagines. This recurrent staging of this aporia underscored the difficult relationship between caste and democracy, between historical difference and inequality. Ambedkar's response was in keeping with the more general tendency of his to invest in institutional responses while remaining skeptical of their transformative effects all the way through. He does this with the economy. He does this, of course, with the Hindu Code Bill and so on and so forth. He's always within and without the state and the idea that the state can be the site of redress. Rather than excising contradiction from the field of politics, then, Ambedkar's actions had effected a signal transformation of the political, which consisted of investing law and the Constitution with the capacity to reveal the state's historic complicity in the extension of caste power. By laying claim to the universal, Ambedkar at this moment of transition was also marking the non-identity of the subaltern subject of rights from the normative universal rights-bearing subject. In Aniket Zaure's powerful formulation, 2 seconds, this is what I'd like to call the stamp on the forehead of the state. I mean stamp in the double sense of a bureaucratic seal of endorsement, as well as a mark of contradiction that is from now on forever visible. This, in a certain sense, is an inversion of the mark of caste, and this is the contradiction, in a sense, that the state must constantly play out, producing the Dalit as a political potentiality and a very particular sort of historical subject and a figure of universality. And what we have here then is a universalism that results from agonism or an embodied particularism that points to a collective political future for which we can only discern a trajectory. The untouchable becoming Dalit then has no substantive content or outline and could be filled in some sense by the kind of form of emancipatory politics that we wish to imagine. I'm sorry for that.
Okay. Last paper presenter is Sunil Purushotham from Fairfield University, USA. And the title of his talk is Violence, Sovereignty in the Indian Republic at 70.
Thank you, and wow, that's going to be difficult to follow up.
I also cut into 3 minutes of your time, so my apologies.
That's quite all right. And thank you for all the organizers for bringing us together today. I'm quite humbled to be included with such a great group. So Alf has asked me to speak on the topic of violence and democracy, so I'll try to give a little bit maybe of the sort of background to both the constitutional debates and some of the transformations that Anu has mapped out. The conventional narrative, of course, associates Indian democracy with nonviolence, both in terms of Gandhi's leadership of the national movement and with the unexpected and unconventional success of parliamentary democracy after 1947. In recent years, however, violence has come to be seen as integral to pre-independence politics, to the birth of the republic, the hegemony of the nation-state, and everyday social and economic relations in an ostensibly democratic society. And I think this is the contradiction that Alf had pointed out in his introduction. There's a general consensus, I think, that the foundational elements of Indian democracy and its constituent antagonistic trajectories date from the late colonial period, and especially from the interwar period. In both the academy and popular media, a fierce debate has raged over the ideas, meanings, and legacies of India's so-called founding fathers. The major ideological contours of Indian politics, right, this is a very sort of Americanized discourse, I think. The major ideological contours of Indian politics were given shape during this period: Gandhianism, Nehruvian secular nationalism, Hindu majoritarian populism, Hindutva, Muslim nationalism, Ambedkarite agonism, and so on and so forth. Communism, it can go on and on. As Shruti Kapila has forcefully argued in a series of articles in a forthcoming book, violence was the master category of Indian political thought during this period. The question of violence, in turn, was not organized along the colonized-colonizer axis, as it would have been for someone like Fanon or others, but was instead linked to the question of fraternity and thus directed not towards the outsider or the other, but towards one's own, the intimate and the familiar. Well before independence, then, Indians were preoccupied with imagining life without the British and how to forge a common political existence without the denial of difference or inequality. Crucially, the questions of violence and freedom in this ideological context became inextricably intertwined. Most of the commentary in recent months, marking the passing of 70 years since 1947, has focused not on the achievement of freedom, however, but on partition violence itself. 1947 has, in other words, become most closely associated with violence, an association, I think, that has sort of overwhelmed earlier triumphalist narratives and elided the constitutive relationship between violence and freedom and violence and democracy. Partition is cast as a tragedy, evidencing the dangerous nature of nationalism itself, or as a destruction or vivisection of the Indian nation rather than its moment of realization, right? So there's this, understanding that independence is also a sort of loss. And even in Nehru's very famous speech, you have this sort of sense, 1947, that was cited by Alf earlier. In these accounts, as in much of the scholarship on partition over the last 2 decades, or 3 decades basically since 1984, the partition is framed as both a traumatic rupture and a protracted process, what some people are calling a long partition. 1947 is seen as an event with an opening but lacking closure, an event that opened up an unresolved traumatic wound that continues to fester, haunting the subcontinent to this day. And I think this is very useful for understanding the lasting and often devastating and all too familiar consequences of the partition, and for encouraging us to approach the event in terms of the way that it was experienced by those who lived through it. Veena Das, for example, has explored how the event comes to structure and permeate social life during ordinary times. So while the stakes of the recent partition scholarship and this sort of commentary surrounding 70 years are quite clear with regard to nationalism, they are less so with regard to democracy, right? And that seems to be often what is missing from this commentary. As illuminating as it is to approach partition as a process, I think we have much to gain, analytically speaking, by approaching it as a discrete event and indeed a rupture. Events, of course, are not single moments in time, but have internal temporalities, sequences marked by opening ruptures or breaks from routine practice, periods of uncertainty and dislocation, and ultimately closure and suturing, marking the resumption of normative time. Yet this resumption of normative time is not simply a return to the status quo ante, but results in durable structural transformations. So my contention then is that the event and the historical processes of its suturing were deeply constitutive of the new nation state and in certain respects foundational to Indian democracy or indeed the republic itself. So as far as the time frame goes, when is the event? How to locate this in a sort of temporal framework? You could even take a few months in 1947. You could argue from June 1947 to January 1950, from the announcement of partition to the founding of the republic. So that would be the period of dominionhood, we could call it that. I think you could push it productively in both directions. To the inauguration of partition violence with the Calcutta killings and the formation of the Constituent Assembly and the interim government in mid-1946, to the first general elections in early 1952. And I think that's the framework I'll work with. So this single event then was itself sort of constituted or comprised of interconnected events, a sort of cascade that dislocated extant structures, disrupted ordinary routines of social life, refashioned power relations, and opened up new historical trajectories. So the sequence I mapped out in my doctoral work began in Punjab, moved on to the princely state of Hyderabad, and ended in Telangana. Obviously, there are so many other events, Gandhi's assassination and the naming of Hindutva as a sort of shadow of secular nationalism. So there are many different ways in which we could, constituent components of this event. And there are, of course, many ways in which this event was transformative and constitutive. But I want to focus on two very general ones. First is the dismantling of an imperial geography in forms of territoriality and the building up of new national ones. Second, the transformation of the colonial state, seen as foreign and external entity, into a republic invested with popular sovereignty, or at least making hegemonic claims to that extent. So the event produced a territorial state that maintained some features of its colonial predecessor, but was in many respects a very new artifact. This process of territorialization occurred in multifarious ways throughout India. One way to look at it is the conventional way of demarcating territorial sovereignty, the making of international borders. Punjab, the epicenter of partition violence, was transformed into a clearly demarcated international border. And it's an artifact not only of Radcliffe's award and of this sort of technical apparatus of the colonial state, but of a thorough process of ethnic cleansing and mass displacement. As the new nation states moved to command clearly demarcated and exclusive national territories, they made great effort to unmix the previously heterogeneous space and to fix national subjects to national territory. And this was a heavily contested process in terms of caste, in terms of women, in terms of labor, and so on and so forth. In Kashmir, too, war created a provisional border that has since become a de facto international one. The sovereignty and very existence of both India and Pakistan were staked on the maintenance of this northwestern border, giving birth to their mutually constitutive dialectic. The contrast with India's border with Bangladesh, still undefined to date, or with the northeastern frontier, I think is instructive on the role, pointing towards the role of violence in producing these borders. From the end of the Second World War, the Indian state increasingly lost whatever monopoly on violence it had previously exercised. And unlike other distinctly modern events of mass violence, partition violence emanated not from the state, but from society. The event was sutured not by taming violence with greater violence, but through processes of absorbing and channeling violence that were in turn deeply constitutive of a new regime of citizenship and sovereignty. Vulnerability and the precariousness of life authorized state intervention in society and invested the state with new expectations. And so here you have, with partition violence, this sort of instantiation of the people, not as a sort of revolutionary force, but as the masses in their sort of purest, most sort of bare form, right? And I think this sort of vulnerability and precariousness of life was crucial at the moment. Efforts of refugee relief and rehabilitation were critical to the legitimation of the new state as distinct from its colonial predecessor. For the first time, people made claims upon the state as a matter of right. And these aren't just the sort of elite, but people of all backgrounds. That is, violence was the sort of primary context for originary invocations of citizenship, making the refugee camp in many ways a foundational site of Indian democracy, sort of counterintuitively. Institutional practices of care and control sought to convert violent, victimized, and displaced populations into docile, settled, and rights-bearing citizens. And of course, this process was foundational not only to citizenship, but to the building of a new regime of state power. Crisis worked to subsume freedom under sovereignty and the stability of the new state. State intervention was integral to what Veena Das has called the descent into the ordinary, the resumption of normative social life, marked by the suturing of the event. This descent included the rearticulation of caste and gender hierarchies, as Ravinder Kaur and others have argued. And Ambedkar is quite interesting on this. He's actually asking for separate refugee camps for Dalits and others, and not to be included, but actually to be given equal rights separately. So it's a recognition of difference, even amongst this sort of universal devastation. Das reminds us, however, that the people were not simply passive victims of state power, but were actively involved in the evolution of the idea of state responsibility, thus pointing to the way in which social panic worked to feed new expectations of and authorize new interventions by the state. And the crisis of partition was also the birth of the developmental state, and authorities saw it as such, saw refugees as raw material for the project of national development, and their efforts were aimed at turning burdens into assets. If you look at the sort of Planning Commission and the Ministry of Refugee Relief and Rehabilitation, this is how the way they're thinking about it. How do we make these people, turn them into what Rajendra Prasad calls useful citizens, right? And East Punjab itself was transformed from a low-yielding area into a surplus state, and Punjabi refugees were held up as ideal national subjects who suffered and sacrificed for the sake of the nation, only to overcome tragedy and commit themselves to the patient work of nation building. So I think I'm going to sort of, I was going to say something about the Constitution, but maybe we'll leave that for the discussion. So that's Punjab and North India more broadly. If Punjab and Kashmir represent the internationalization of an imperial geography, Hyderabad represents the domestication and dissolution of an imperial geography within the national. The constitutional standing of the princely states had been a long-standing point of contention and confusion, especially since 1919, when efforts were first begun to bring princely and British India into an all-India federation. Interwar processes of constitutional reform worked at once to secure the legal and institutional basis of princely sovereignty and to open them up to attack by bringing them closer together with British India, right? And this is the effect of the 1935 Act. And Congress and League opposition to the Act and its proposed federation were based precisely on princely claims to sovereignty. The Muslim League on the basis that most of the Rajas were Hindus and would then thus swamp whatever guaranteed representation is there. And the Congress issued their demand for the Constituent Assembly only after the 1935 Act in direct response to princely claims for sovereignty. Right? Previously, the demand for a Constituent Assembly had never been issued formally on the basis of popular sovereignty. So even by the time of independence, the princely question had hardly been resolved. But I think there is a way of thinking about partition, especially the Congress' willingness to accept partition, is on the condition that the princes were cut out of the deal. So the British end this triangulation between the princes, the princes, the Congress, and the Muslim League just by making it a more binary, sort of bipartisan sort of deal. The erasure of princely territoriality and the constitutional distinction between the two Indias was a contested and violent process. Most obviously, the coercive institutions of the colonial state were commandeered by the Congress and redeployed in service of the national project. In Hyderabad, this took the form of what is known as the police action in September 1948. Yet, transitioning from an anti-colonial nationalist movement into a ruling party, the Congress did not simply give up agitation and popular mobilization, but rather than aiming at subverting state authority, subaltern violence was sought to be converted, co-opted, and channeled, disciplined, one could say, in service of the national project. So I think there are some parallels with the BJP-RSS sort of relationship today. Unlike in Punjab, where state sovereignty was built up through efforts to absorb and subdue violence by converting a highly mobilized situation into a settled order, in and around Hyderabad there was a dispersal and mobilization of violence, which served as a sort of ground-clearing exercise for a state making claims to popular sovereignty and territorial hegemony. On the one hand, there was the state and Congress-sponsored action. In the provinces and districts surrounding Hyderabad, as in Kashmir and elsewhere, tens of thousands of so-called home guards were raised and armed. Something like 60,000 rifles were sent within a few months' period. Home guards occupied a liminal position. They were endowed with the capacity to exercise violence on behalf of the state, but were not properly of the state. And if you look at the reports of district administrators, district level administrators at the time, especially in Maharashtra, they're just distributing weapons quite freely. So it's not a process of arrogating and monopolizing violence, but actually dispersing it. And on the other hand, there was a contingent ideological conjuncture that brought activists from the Congress, Hyderabad State Congress, Socialist Party, Arya Samaj, and the Hindu Mahasabha together in a violent campaign of disruption and sabotage aimed at contesting Hyderabad's sovereignty and laying the ground for overt state intervention in the form of the police action. So what you have is this sort of dispersal, and then the state moves in afterwards. And Patel, of course, was the key figure here, who in a quasi-Maoist mode, I think, sought to consolidate state power not by arrogating and monopolizing violence for the state, but through the dispersal of violence into the body politic. And Patel was central to the transformation of the mobilizational architecture of nonviolent satyagraha into violent action previously, during the Quit India movement, which in many respects foreshadowed post-war mobilizations. So Nehru and Patel get into a sort of spat after the police action, and Nehru is quite concerned about all the reports of violence emerging out of Hyderabad. And Patel sort of brushes him off and says it represents nothing short of a revolution. And this is he's referring directly to what we can call an anti-Muslim pogrom in Hyderabad. And he says this is nothing short of a revolution, an articulation, that's his direct words, an articulation of popular sovereignty long suppressed under an artificial and foreign structure, finding utterance. So unlike earlier nationalist denunciations of communal violence as irrational urges of the unwashed masses, that is, as essentially social or religious, Patel was pained to portray this violence as essentially political and, more importantly, as foundational, a coming together of the nation with the state. And such violence did indeed, I think, help clear the way for the establishment of a majoritarian republican polity, in which sovereignty would be derived from the demos rather than dynasty, or what Patel called the ultimate paramountcy of popular interests, to use a sort of constitutional term here. Of course, the violence in Hyderabad was largely directed at Muslims, points to the majoritarian nature of popular sovereignty and to the ways in which events cascaded during this period, how anxieties of civil war and fratricide in North India worked to transfer the modular idiom of communalism to peninsular India. And there are ways in which a sort of kingship form of kingship is sort of occupied and dispatched, and maybe we can talk about that later as well. And again, this is a rupture in which the Muslim as a category undergoes sort of dramatic resignification vis-a-vis Indian democracy. And of course, not all popular mobilizations of this period were supportive of either the Congress or the nation-state project. One of the major, if implicit, I think, questions raised by Ranaji Guha in the Subaltern Studies project was why wasn't there a revolution in India? And this is sort of the implicit question underneath sort of Alf's opening statement. How did bourgeois incrementalism arrogate independence and freedom over more radical alternatives? And I think the revolutionary potential of the upheavals of 1947 was in many ways exhausted in fratricidal violence that fed into state formation, right? So there's actually this reification process here. Moreover, there was actually a revolution, an aborted one, but there was in Telangana and elsewhere throughout India. The CPI at this time was upholding its sort of false independence line. And Telangana was seen to be India's Yannan. And it raises a number of issues which are relevant, I think, here. First, you have the domestication of communism within the national and the subordination of class struggle to a procedural parliamentarism and developmentalism as the outcome of this. State violence was crucial to demarcating the political sphere and channeling radical politics into constitutional paths. There's this sort of incorporation that happens. And second, it established Maoism as the shadow of the liberal nation state and forged the link between Maoism and so-called tribal politics at India's internal frontier. The Andhra Provincial Committee in April of 1948 openly adopted a Maoist line of people's war. And it was the first articulation that I'm aware of Maoism outside of China, and it's even before the triumph of the revolution occurs in China itself, right? The Chinese Civil War is still going on at this point. So again, it's not the proletariat, but the peasant that becomes the sort of universal figure, at least for Asia at this moment. So maybe we can talk about that as well. Third, what you see is a dispersal, again, a dispersal of violence, but also its routinization rather than its sort of suturing up as you get in Hyderabad in general. You get a sort of routinization of violence at India's internal frontiers. And I think what I'm calling India's internal frontiers, and this raises important questions about the anti-democratic nature of the law, including the Constitution itself and the project of national development. Right. So how much time do I have left in my?
Well,
have I exhausted
a minute.
A minute. Okay. So I'm not going to sort of then get into the description of Telangana itself, but I just want to say a few things about the way the state responded that I think we can connect more closely to our current situation. One is, while the princely geography of the Raj was dissolved, much of the colonial legal and jurisdictional architecture relating to forest and tribal areas was maintained, and I'm sure Nandini will say something about this. The Indian state responded in familiar ways. Telangana was declared a special area, a space of exception marked by the suspension of civil laws. And so this is a predecessor to the Defense of India Act and AFSPA, but it's a way in which lawlessness or these areas are sort of marked as frontiers in a similar way that you get in the Northeast as well. The encounter became routinized, and I think the encounter, the so-called police encounter, becomes this sort of signature form of state violence in India. And I think it's important because it's not spectacular or public or avowed. Indeed, it's hidden and disavowed and denied altogether, right? So there is this sort of aspect to it. Second, a series of ameliorative or developmental measures were implemented, and I think there is a way in which the Constitution seeks to sort of answer the social question that then authorizes and legitimates new forms of state violence, right? So I think this is, what Arendt sort of said about the French Revolution in some ways. But whole populations were removed from the hills and forests and relocated to tribal rehabilitation centers on the premise that these were necessary steps to give them their constitutional rights as one could say differentiated subjects, as sort of scheduled tribes deserving of special treatment. And again, the state attempted to consolidate its authority, not very successfully, through a dispersal of violence. Home guards, village defense squads, Gram Raksha Dals were formed throughout Telangana. And in tribal areas, where I find a remarkable parallel with current events, authorities deputized what they called special police constables, so what they called SPCs rather than SPOs, and organized what they called around 15 Koya tiger squads, who are the parallels, one could say, of today's Koya commandos, right? So there are some sort of interesting parallels. Nevertheless, the real story here is that the solution to the revolution was not simply state repression and violence, but was incorporation and was a political solution. And I think I'm not really sure if the Indian state has ever successfully executed a counterinsurgency without a political solution at the end, right? It's never sort of won that battle. So just to conclude very, very quickly, the Nehruvian nation state sought to sublimate its constituent antagonisms, and the violent events of the late 1940s facilitated, I think, the conversion of long-standing contradictions and antagonisms into a settled institutional order. Revolutionary politics was pushed to the frontiers or converted into parliamentarism, poverty and class conflict into centralized planning and state-led development, caste-based social strife into affirmative action and adversarial electoral politics, regional and linguistic identities into federalism, religious difference into secularism, popular sovereignty into a universal regime of citizenship rights and franchise. And of course, none of these contradictions or antagonisms were resolved, but they were routinized and institutionalized. And in all of these ways, we can see democracy itself as a means of converting violence into nonviolence. And again, this points to what Shruti Kapila has called Indian democracy's sort of essentially agonistic character. And it's a sort of a word you used as well, so I think it's something we can also talk about. How can we understand agonism as sort of essential to Indian democracy? So I think I'll stop.
Okay,
there.
thank you. Okay, Ajay, you can take my seat.
Should we just bring another chair?
Yeah.
Why don't you keep sitting recording. I'll go here and manage.
Oh, okay.
I'll just help myself to some water first because I've been dying of thirst all morning. Thank you. Well, thank you for these lovely and profoundly generative papers. Anu's work, of course, I've taken pleasure in allowing to think now for nearly 2 decades now. But this time around, there's the additional pleasure of familiarizing myself with the work of 2 young scholars whom I've been hearing of for some time now, Sandipto and Sunil. As my point of departure today, let me take Sunil's fascinating delineation of the intertwined events of independence and partition. Sunil puts it very crisply and succinctly, and I should say that much of what I'm going to say, not this part, but later, I mean, I'm also drawing on things that were there in the paper, but that are not, that they didn't necessarily talk about as much. In a sense, I think it'll complement what they're saying. Yeah. So Sunil puts it very crisply and succinctly, and he read this part out. Events, of course, are not single moments in time, but have an internal temporality. A sequence marked by an opening rupture or break from routine practice, a period of uncertainty and dislocation, and ultimately a closure and suturing, marking the resumption of normative time. And as Sunil was also mentioning, this new time is different from the time that preceded it, right? And for both Sunil and Sandipto, what they are doing is bringing out the eventfulness of independence as distinct from partition. And of course, these are 2 intertwined events, but they're also events with very different temporalities, right? And it's the interplay between them that is important. Now, independence as an eventfulness, I think there are 2 things that emerge very clearly, and those 2 registers are eventfulness, are revolution and freedom. Yeah? And I'd like to keep them on the horizon as I make 3 remarks about 1 remark each about each of the papers, because there's not too much time after all. And the first, 1 register of the difference in the eventfulness of partition and independence is, as Sunil emphasizes both in this essay and perhaps even more elsewhere, especially in his essay on Hyderabad, is the difference in their violence. In the Hyderabad essay, he introduces the concept that's also working in this essay more quietly. That is the concept of internal violence, as distinct from external violence. While external violence is directed at another, internal violence is directed at an intimate or familiar. Implicit in what Sunil suggests is what one might say is a 3-fold distinction. On the one, the self, the other, and the familiar. Right? We often think of violence as directed at the other, and relatedly of violence as othering its target. But violence does not only other its target. We just have to remember the phrase domestic violence to remember that violence also has some very intimate targets. And I take one implication of what Sunil is suggesting to be that while partition is the moment of a social violence against the other, independence is inaugurated by a double movement of legitimization. On the one hand, a governmentalizing violence that absorbs, which is also said to say internalizes, right? That absorbs the effects of the external violence inflicted by the other, and that's the sense in which Sunil was talking of refugee camps as the founding moment. And on the other hand, a violence against the intimate, right? And I would add here that the slippage between, on the one hand, intimacy and internality, and on the other hand, otherness and externality, is both suggestive and absolutely crucial, because as you know, intimacy is not the same as internality any more than otherness is the same as externality. It's very, very productive to the arguments that both of them are making. The consequences of this internal and intimate violence continue today. But Alf asked me specifically to try and relate it more to the contemporary moment. And I suspect that one change that has occurred since the time that Sunil writes about is something that we can think through by drawing on what Sandipto is talking about. What has always made the distinction between intimate and othering violence so charged is that each always threatens to cross over into the other, to become its opposite, with the intimate becoming the other becoming the intimate. But through the second or half of the 20th century, the violence against other Indians could largely be regarded as an intimate violence because of what I shall call the authority of the public sphere. And authority here is a concept which can come back to this in the discussion, which I'm in some senses contrasting to hegemony. But let me indicate here for now what I mean by the authority of the public sphere. Sandipto notes, as at least in the full version, and he repeated this again today, when their lack of representativeness was pointed out, Ambedkar would argue that their legitimacy was based on wisdom and knowledge they brought, which was most likely superior to that of any representatives chosen on the basis of direct and universal franchise. So Sandipto traces very well how the Constitution emerges in this public sphere. Now, what I want to stress is that this emphasis on wisdom and knowledge is absolutely crucial to the public sphere. And it was shared not only by liberal secularists such as Nehru or radical secularists such as Ambedkar, even Hindu nationalists found its pull very, very compelling, as we can discern from even a cursory reading of Savarkar, Golwalkar, or Munshi. Right? They too claim the public sphere by stressing the universality of Hinduism. The reason I'm stressing the public sphere so much is the public sphere, which we should not confuse with publicness, right, is not representative so much of the people as of the universality of the people, right? And I think this is very, very important, that not the people, but the universality of the people. Put differently, if the public sphere represented the people, it did not do so democratically. At least if we understand democracy as in electoral terms, or if you understand democracy as a ventriloquizing of the voice of the people. So the reason I'm stressing this is because it seems to me that where the public sphere exists, violence directed at dissenters could more easily be cast as intimate violence. This is because this public sphere can claim to represent a universality which is nevertheless representative of and intimate to that which is outside it. But this concept of the public sphere has been disintegrating ever since then, right? And publicness, I think, of a certain sort has come to replace the public sphere. And perhaps latest by 2000s. And today it's disintegrating, one might say, even in the West, which is supposed to be its bastion, right? Which is itself a very, very interesting phenomenon. It would take us too long to explore what enabled the emergence of the public sphere from the 18th century or what caused its demise by the late 20th century. Suffice here to note that in India, symptomatic of that disintegration is the decline of the authority of the RSS within the Hindutva formation. Modi's own trajectory would be very interesting to explore here, because there is this early moment where he writes this account that tries to align himself with the RSS genealogy. And later, now that is very, very marginal. So there's no longer an attempt to claim an intellectual genealogy that partakes of the Hindutva public sphere, even, which is itself a fascinating transformation. So perhaps one can extend Sunil's insight to argue that one of the most striking transformations of intimate violence is the growing pervasiveness of this crossover between intimate and othering violence. This pervasiveness is itself an history in the event of internal violence. This event, I'm tempted to speculate, begins in Gujarat in 2001 and closes in India in 2014. The event is also marked by the emergence of a new organization of violence. Now, the older, even millennial, threefold distinction between self, other, and intimate, which I began with, comes to be articulated within a newer twofold distinction, that between subject and object, right? So two ways of thinking of violence then, self, other, intimate, and subject and object, right? This distinction is old in the history of external violence, but is relatively new in the history of internal violence. And perhaps it's enabled by precisely what I was talking of here, the collapse of the public sphere. The second aspect of independence as an event is what Sandipto stresses again, transformational constitutionalism, a phrase that he uses very powerfully in the essay, which he did not dwell on enough at least to my mind here, because I thought it was absolutely crucial to his argument. His point about people and parliamentarianism was in some senses drawing on that, right? For me, one aspect of this event seemed especially relevant, Sandipto's argument that the context of Ambedkar's speech makes it clear that his goal in pointing out the absence of certain norms of political behavior was not to make a case for their cultivation, but rather to, in the Constitution, deal with their absence. Right? This is very, very different, right? Not to say that, look, you have to cultivate these, but to say that, look, it's not there, what are we going to do? Yeah. And that's why, in some senses, parliamentarianism, and that's also several of the other things that he notes, that there's safeguards against a plebiscitarian claim to represent the people against the constraining, above the constraining mechanisms of the Constitution. And precisely, again, because constitutional morality could not be taken for granted, it was necessary to continue the repressive powers of the state. And, obviously you can see resonances here with Hindu nationalism, which is both, shall we say, restrained by and enabled by this transformational constitutionalism. Since we are running out of time, I shall quickly move to the third, this thing, which is Anu's remark. And my third remark really is about, as usual, remarkably generative and thought-provoking, and I found myself agreeing with so much that I want to add something to that I hope rhymes with what she's saying. She reminds us of a dimension of the event, especially of the event of independence, which is crucial, and that I would call its futurity. Right? In a sense, I think Alf also refers to this when he cited Nehru at the beginning, when he said that, look, freedom. Right? Now, the interesting thing about freedom as a concept is freedom is not the same as freedoms. Right? Freedom is precisely that which exceeds every concrete freedoms, all concrete freedoms. Right? So there's a kind of way in which freedom is a futurity, which freedoms, shall we say, are in various ways both realizing and falling short of. And in a way, what's interesting about Ambedkar, what's interesting about both Sandipto's and Anu's paper is that this futurity is also being thought in a particular way. Freedom is being translated not into social equality. Yeah? That's it. You begin with this abstract concept of freedom, but you are also translating this abstract concept of freedom into another abstract concept, social equality. The absence of social equality, Ambedkar is deeply concerned with, as everybody noted in their essays. Actually, there was the same quote in 3 essays.
Gotta change the script here.
So as we know, the quote is about the need for social equality, right? As we know, the challenge is partially that social equality is much more difficult to institutionalize than political equality, which can, to some degrees, be institutionalized through the rights of man and rights of citizen, or some variation of that. This is not least because the social cannot be defined in terms of a sphere or a criterion. The social is a sphere that resists sphericity, so to speak, or that resists boundedness. Yeah. So redressing social inequality often turns out to be like a game of whack the mole. You whack it at one place, and another social inequality emerges somewhere else, and you find you're back at exactly where you started. So Ambedkar, keen reader of Marx, is nevertheless aware that there are certain conditions under which a certain kind of social equality becomes pervasive. This is the condition that Marx notes in Capital, and I'll quote Marx here. It's a lovely, powerful quote, which I'm actually writing about right now in another essay. And the quote is this: "The secret of the expression of value, namely the equality and equivalence," he uses both these phrases, equality and equivalence, of all kinds of labor, because and insofar as they are human labor in general, could not be deciphered until the concept of human equality had acquired the permanence of a fixed popular opinion. This, however, becomes possible only in a society where the commodity form is the universal form of the product of labor. This is a very intriguing passage, but for now I just want to note one tension in this formulation. Right? On the one hand, Marx here invokes the concept of concrete human equality. Right? And that is to say, for it is this equality that is calling a fixed popular opinion. On the other hand, The equality that is made visible in labor is the equality of abstract human labor, right? So on the one hand, there's concrete equality, which emerges as opinion, and on the other hand, there's abstract labor, which is the real. So in some senses, one may say the opinion has no value in itself. Rather, the opinion reveals the value of abstract labor, and abstract labor is value itself, right? So there's a certain way in which the opinion serves as a kind of way into things. Moreover, the opinion is precisely that which does not have reality, right? Because it is only an opinion. Concrete human equality remains both invoked and postponed. This happens elsewhere too in his writings, as we know, for example, the Critique of the Gotha program, which postpones concrete equality to a communist future, and that says that, insists that even in the moment of transition, bourgeois equality will have to continue. Indeed, it would not be an exaggeration to say that all of capital is a turn away from concrete human equality as an opinion to not only the abstract labor, but also the abstract equality that it makes visible. So, I mean, the reason I'm saying all this about Marx is as a kind of preface to what I want to say about Ambedkar, right? Ambedkar is, of course, too sophisticated a reader of Marx to not recognize the force of Marx's caveats. He's also too committed to concrete equality as more than an opinion to accept these caveats. And this is the aporia, the egoism that in some senses Ambedkar has to inhabit. On the one hand, he clearly welcomes human equality as a fixed popular opinion. That's part of the reason he's so enthusiastic about about cities, etc., and that's why he's also has, as Anu notes, a general tendency to invest in institutional responses. And in a sense, I think one massive transformation, again bringing it back to the present, that has happened in the decades since then, is that social equality has become pervasive, or as the human equality in Marx's sense has become pervasive. I don't mean social equality has become, but social equality as opinion has become pervasive, shall we say. Again, exactly what Marx was talking about. But it has become pervasive precisely as opinion. That is to say, as something said, but also disavowed. Right? So that's very different from, that's why I want to stress this word opinion. In other words, a fixed popular opinion about human equality is not the answer. Rather, it's the beginning of a set of questions. Yeah? It opens up a field of possibilities, both sociologically and ethically. I'm tempted to say, therefore, that the event that has taken place in India in the early 21st century, and taken place perhaps also in US and Europe at the same time, contra Marx, is the unfolding of the sociological consequences of a human equality, and of that fixed popular opinion. And it's those ethical possibilities that, in some senses, clearly Ambedkar is trying to think as Navayana Buddhism, right? And in some senses also the Constitution. Well, there are so many other things I could say, but I'll just stop here. Thank you very much for those really, really generative.
Okay, thank you.
You saw your sign coming. This is great.
Now, I think what we can begin by allowing each of the paper presenters to respond to these comments. So, Sandipto, would you like to say anything?
Sure. Very, very briefly, because I hopefully have time for rest. I think, the most thing I'm going to say is that there's some really good formulations, which I think Ajay gave, which will be helpful for thinking some of the things. I think this one fascinating one for me, which I should have mentioned in the paper itself, is that there's some ways I think a democratic project or a project of a movement is to create these new languages, right, through which people can speak and fight. And the administrative project is to deal with the problem of a lack of ways of speaking, and then therefore measuring, how to listen, how to measure, how to see, and so on and so forth. I think that's one good way of distinguishing what I was trying to say between what could be a democratic constitutional or revolutionary constitutional project versus a more administrative constitutional project. And the other point I want to just quickly maybe regarding another piece which I didn't had a chance to really go into in my thing, is this precisely this distinction between the people as some form of an organized group of, we can say, either interests or ones who kind of find a way into the assembly, right? And this actually is a really whole fascinating history of the way people find a way into the assembly, from the French Revolution onwards to the Mexican Revolution. So this is kind of the whole question of the actuals of the whole politics, the presence of the people in the assembly, or in some form, you know, outside the assembly through kind of, and there is a sense, and I don't want to push this point too strongly, but there's a sense of a slight relief, in sense, that is not happening. You know, there's a whole argument as to when the oppression is made that, well, the future parliaments are going to be chosen by a universal franchisee. Shouldn't they have a high legitimacy in terms of how can we tell them to bind them or constrain them in some sense? And there's this whole argument that we are working in the quiet, which is kind of fascinating precisely because a moment of absolute not quiet, right? All the things we talked about from partition to everything. So there is something about the structure of the Constitutional Assembly which provides, so there's a kind of very interesting tension here of this sort of radical quiet which reached by this sort of high and wise goal of making a constitution, while there's tremendous cacophony outside, right? So that's the moment I would have to say that of this thing of anxiety, because you also have a sense, you relish the quiet, but you also very much know that quiet is very, extraordinarily fragile, extraordinarily not based in a strong sort of concrete foundation, which you could do if you, for example, were the leaders of a victorious sort of revolution or civil war or something. And in some sense, that's not the case, right? So there's kind of a double appreciation of the quiet and a deep anxiety that we are kind of living in a kind of a dream world, a world of make-believe, which won't last long if we don't know how to listen to those who are outside. Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, Anu?
Okay, can we be here? And
Yeah,
yes, okay.
yeah.
I don't have much to say. I'd love to get comments and feedback. So I think there's just one very quick kind of response. I agree with what Ajay said and suggested. And I think this question of sort of the eventedness of the event and its future is very interesting to think in terms of both Marx and Buddhism. So the question, I think, and one might go back to Ambedkar and ask, when is the event? And what is the event? Is the event Buddhism? Is the event the revolution, the counter-revolution that actually destroys the possibility of a kind of Buddhist ethicality for India, right? So there's a constant way in which, the eventedness of the event and its imagination of the future new time is always referring back to something that is both millennial and then archaic, and then one needs to think the remnant. And so I think this real question of then how does one rewrite a history, how does one participate in a project of history if your relationship to the event is so unstable, right? And so, and I think this, this comes up. So, when is this moment? And is the moment going to be that first moment where, Buddhism, discovers sort of biological life and suffering? Is it the possibility of constitutional redress? Is it the moment of partition where indeed these two histories of Dalit and Muslim are both kind of fundamentally separated but can't be thought the one without the other? Something else I think that's very interesting, Ajay, in what you said about the public sphere and the way in which there's a kind of resignification of intimacy and otherness and the remaking for the grounds of violence. So it seems to me that this question of past, future, but also of the archaic and the remnant is something that is kind of interesting to think through. And secondly, it seems to me, again, if the question is really to think about the relationship between the concrete and the abstract, right, which is indeed the question of how does one think the constant deferment of the project of equality, even as one must constantly inhabit, right, the opinion, the making, the fixity of human opinion around the need for it, then it seems to me that there's something very interesting in terms of what you've suggested then about the public sphere and the ways in which this public sphere actually reorganizes and reanimates the capacity for violence and therefore for the production of new kinds of subjects of inequality through which equality must be thought. And so indeed, yes, I think the project for Marxism is not the imagination of equality, it is the imagination of inequality, right? And its specification, specifying the grounds for inequality, with equality a constant deferral, but also something that actually can't be imagined, right? And hence that kind of conversation for Ambedkar as well with Marx and Buddha, it seems to me. And the return, it's only in the return that we actually have the instantiation of a moment where that equality was possible. Because the actual project of thinking it into the future renders it completely open. And he is, not merely too good a reader of Marx, but a very good reader of precisely this problem of the people, not merely as the space for rethinking sovereignty and popular sovereignty, but also as a space for a kind of multitude that can't be tamed and controlled. So that kind of struggle, I think, is very interesting.
Okay.
I don't think I have much to add other than to thank Ajay for his comments, but I would like, I think we should bring in other people rather than
Okay.
have, I think we all spoke too long anyways.
Okay, so the floor is open. Yes?
Yeah, a couple of, one is, where is sovereignty? In the sense that I think a lot of what you said is directly or indirectly about sovereignty, and to me it kind of appears in this way. So, for example, Sunil, when you sort of talked about the princely states, and one could look at a number of other princely states as well. As you're aware, you could not actually have a full-fledged nationalist movement in those places. Many of them had a kind of surrogate thing going on, the Prajamatas and so on. So there's right away a kind of a scenario within the overall geography that they are not entirely the people, and that there are going to be articles of accession or, in fact, annexation that will bring them into the people. And this is not just the case with Goa or with Hyderabad. For example, for a 2-year period, I recently learned there was a communist republic set up in Garhwal, which only became incorporated into the Indian Union in 1949. So, there is that. The second issue is, I think this goes more to Anupama and also to Sandipto. In terms of the Rossier references, if you look at his hatred of democracy, very early on he sets up a very interesting problematic in that book, which is where he says that the problem is, do we think of liberty and equality that must necessarily go through the institutions of the state and of law in order to, or as a substitute for them actually becoming everyday practice, right? And then one could think from that in terms of 3 or 4 different political positions. One, the conservative one, in which there is no possibility or desirability of liberty and equality. Second, a liberal one, in which the institutions of the law and state are the constant through which you can achieve the other side. A third, a fascist one, in which this does not matter. You have
Yeah.
the leader and the people
Yeah.
eventually.
Yeah.
And then a fourth one, the kind of a new communist one, in which you erase all of that and you have an acephalous kind of a way of arriving at this scenario. In the Indian political spectrum, the fourth possibility does not exist. Even if you look at it in terms of Indian communism, or in fact, as one of you just, in fact, Ajay, when pointing out from the water program, says, when you're looking at that transitional phase, which will obviously never come to an end, it is actually, and in fact, Kevin makes an argument there as well about the adoption of the bourgeois state as being a necessary element for the transition to communism in a full-scale kind of way. We have an interesting set of political positions that hit exactly on that very small question, or very large question, of how do you go beyond the institutions of the law and the state in order to do all of this. I just want to close my comment by pointing to something I use for teaching. If you look at the frontispiece of Hobbes' Leviathan, something you might remember this, there's a gigantic figure who is made up of very minuscule figures inside of it. There is not a single figure that lies outside the contour of the gigantic figure, right? It is an entire kind of unity and singularity between the people with the capital P, as Sandipto was talking about, as Sandipto was talking about, and the peoples with the small p. Politics that wants to erase that difference between the people with the big P and the people with the small p is the politics
So
Okay.
you to answer those, or should we collect
Yes.
more questions? Or,
For time purposes?
Yeah,
Or-
maybe collect some.
Yeah.
however,
What'd you say, Alf?
I said that we can take some questions back to back, I think.
Okay, so you're next?
No, I'm not next.
well, why don't we answer this one while people gather
Okay.
their thoughts? Just to say very briefly about sovereignty, I mean, this is the sort of central, concern of my project, and I mean, in particular with the princely states, I mean, I think this has been completely overlooked and de-emphasized with our emphasis on Hindu-Muslim. I mean, during the interwar period, all the way up to the cabinet mission, I mean, the price of Indian unity is princely sovereignty, right? And in the opening statement of the Constituent Assembly, Nehru says India can be nothing but a republic, right? So there is this sort of fundamental antagonism, and this is why the Congress rejects federation outright. And so there is this sort of continued sort of legal constitutional recognition of princely sovereignty all the way up until 1952-3, when the sort of Part A, B, and C parts of the Indian Union are all merged under a single constitutional regime. But at the same time, the first half of 1947, Nehru's, the premise of him, he's willing to accept partition from February. And he says, but the basis we have one partition, not many. Any state that declares independence or seeks to separate will be an enemy and will be treated as such and will be at war with Indian Union, right? And so what you see, not just in Hyderabad, but in Kashmir and Junagadh and elsewhere, in these sort of states that seek to sort of their independence, is this sort of mobilization of the people contra princely sovereignty. And so there is this sort of way in which the sort of mobilizational architecture is sought to be linked to a Republican one in pretty new and interesting ways. And it's quite remarkable. It does get dissolved quite quickly, this sort of structure that's, since at least 1857, has been remarkably durable. So I think it is a sort of one of the this transformation is sort of underemphasized in many ways. I don't know if you want to.
Well, I have a question for you, actually. You were talking about sovereignty in terms of the sovereignty of the native states, but what would be the sovereignty of the Indian nation under the conditions that you describe, where violence is part of the event of freedom? How does this new nation, let's say in the first 10 years, stake out its sovereignty under these circumstances?
Vis-a-vis the princely states.
No, vis-a-vis the rest of the population. We're talking about, okay, there are two senses of sovereignty. There's the sovereignty of one state versus another state. There's also the sovereignty of the state, which is the nature of legitimacy of the state, which people will have some kind of faith in, even though it doesn't operate the way it should, according to its promise all the time.
Right. Well, I think, questions of sovereignty are largely over by, I think, the early 1950s. I think everything, the Muslim nationality question has been solved or resolved, and they've now been returned to a sort of religious minority deserving of special protections. And all other sort of regional identities are become sort of federal, sort of managed through the federal process, right? So I think maybe perhaps in the Northeast, there are questions, lingering questions about sovereignty, but I think.
But it's also a new moment of a kind of internationalism, if you will.
Right.
So
of
I thought your
course,
question
yeah.
was also sort of, where is the UN or the moment of Bandung? And so, in a sense, coming right back to this question of the eventedness of the event, right? So when then does decolonization end, right? So there's a kind of political history, and then there's a kind of history of ideas. And that too is an important question, and I thought maybe you were asking that too.
Right, and how the people fit into the international is also, there
but
are
also-
serious tensions there as well.
Right.
And, Nehru is, I'm writing about Nehru at the moment, is sort of, very troubled by this question, whether it's vis-a-vis the Commonwealth or the Third World and Bandung and the UN as well. And he's sort of willing to try all of them, but this sort of tension, but also sort of necessity of Republican sovereignty vis-a-vis sort of international institutions is. And international law, the sort of liberal world of international law, is riven with tensions, but also seemingly necessary at this sort of point. So there is this sort of fear of the masses, and this is sort of Dipesh Chakrabarti makes it, but also this sort of faith in them as well, and that these two sort of go hand in hand in some ways, right? There's a way in which they're sought to be channeled and subsumed and sublimated, but also sort of disavowed in some ways, right? I'm not sure if I'm answering your question directly, but
I think I see your point. I think I see your approach to it. I was thinking of something somewhat different, but this fits with what we were talking about earlier. Okay, Alf?
Yeah, I have a question that's perhaps primarily directed to Sunil, but I think it also speaks to elements of what both Anu and Sandipto have to say. So I'm concerned with, I'm interested in the mobilization of state violence against internal or against popular revolts in the closing decades, if you will, of the freedom struggle and the opening years of the new republic. And I'm wondering, and so it goes to the relationship between popular radicalism and the making of the state and the conclusion of the freedom struggle, which in a sense touches on all your three presentations. But I'm wondering, is it possible to see the more direct mobilization of state violence that you see perhaps most flagrantly in Telangana, but also arguably in sort of with the Valli revolts in Maharashtra a few years earlier, as part of a longer phase in the way as a longer phase in the dynamic of the freedom struggle, and that the dynamic between, if you will, dominant and subaltern registers of nationalism there. It strikes me that that moment of the mobilization of state violence could be read euphemistically as the truce moment in Bipin Chandra's formulation of struggle, truce, struggle at a larger scale. And I'm emphasizing the euphemism here. I mean, for Ranjit Guha, this would be the discipline moment of discipline and mobilize. And I'm just wondering that if you look at it from like the 1920s, when Congress becomes a mass movement, and the response from above to peasant radicalism has to be that of the disbanding of a campaign, saying, no, we're calling it off. If you guys burn down police stations, etc., and kill people, we're calling it off. Arguably similar things happen around civil disobedience and so on and so forth. So at the same time as popular radicalism starts to change from a sort of, let's call it a millenarian, a more millenarian, leaning towards peasant millenarianism, towards more, I suppose, even more militant and more organized forms of peasant radicalism, infused perhaps with a sort of incipient Maoism. The response, also as Congress becomes more and more the state, changes its character, goes from the disbanding, if you will, the sort of we're not doing this, to the mobilization of state force. I'm just wondering if that would be a sort of another dimension of what you're talking about that is part of drawing, if you will, or creating that moment where transformation constitutionalism becomes a possibility, where you can incorporate the kind of radical readings of what the new what the new nation should be, as Anu talked about, into a manageable political project for dominant elites that take the helm of the state. Okay, that was really convoluted. I'm going to stop now.
Should I take a stab at it? I mean, obviously, I think the mobilization of state violence is crucial to the Gandhian project, right? Faisal Devji makes this point that the moral superiority of nonviolence can only be tested against violence, right? And so this is what he calls the temptation of violence, and crucial then to sort of the manufacturing of the people as such through this sort of forms of sacrifice and sort of provoking the sort of coercive institutions of the colonial state. I mean, I think the Quit India movement is quite different from the civil disobedience and non-cooperation movements in that it does turn quite violent, and there is no disavowal of that by the Congress leadership at that point. And I think that is also the raising their stakes, but also a way in which they're quite confident that this could be to their advantage. If it does spiral out of control, they will be there to sort of rescue the colonial state, if it were, from the chaos that Gandhi so desired, right? He was to lead India to chaos and anarchy. was seen to be a perfectly acceptable thing for them. But I think, yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to add.
I mean, it depends on how one cuts into your question, right? It is quite broad. You know, one would be to offer the kind of response that Sunil does. The other, because we've been talking about when do we locate the event, right? So even for constitutionalism, one could think 35. And so if I could just take us back a little bit to the interwar and so forth, there's a question of kind of depoliticization, which is the point that I take, right? So the demobilization, there's massive strikes, of course. So in Bombay from 28 onwards, the kind of strike action that's happening is happening together with the anti-court agitations. And this is really where Godavari Parulekar comes to the fore. And then you've got the Wadli revolts. So peasant radicalism and strike action in the 20s and the 30s, it seems to me, are constantly sort of going back and forth. Proletariat or peasant, it's not clear. In fact, the proletariat is the peasant, right, very often. And so if you think about what happens with the Communist Party, for instance, in Bombay, well, most of them are Kunbi laborers, and this is why Ambedkar has to say, we will not participate in the strikes, because they are as casteist as they are communist. But anyways, but the point to be made, I guess, is, you know, one, the interwar and what's going on. The second, Alf, is the fact that the Congress Party itself, it seems to me, gets quite radicalized, right? So in 37, the fact that the Praja Socialists actually, so in a sense, everything but the most radical communist wing, in a sense, gets associated into Congress. And if I could think about peasant politics, again thinking Maharashtra, by 1930, the Congress is completely Maratha. Right? So, I mean, it is a dominant caste party already at this point in time. So I think this has some real implications for the way that we're thinking then later about both peasant and strike action. So that would be one. And this is also asking a broader question of writing a certain kind of movement histories, or writing about the history of heterodox Marxism, which is the question also I think that Subir is asking. And if we actually begin to think about the kind of closures that we're beginning to see already by the late 1920s to the possibilities of a kind of heterodox Marxism, which is completely connected with post-Khilafat organization, with the fact that Marxism is as much infused by a kind of ethical idea of Islam, and to go to someone like, to think about Iqbal and so on and so forth, that's the history of the Marxism one inherits. And the process into the 30s, it seems to me, is a kind of cleansing or a rewriting of those possibilities, those heterodox, everyday possibilities, such that, Subir can say, look, we don't have the possibility of having that kind of, Paris Commune, Kristen Ross kind of, communal luxury kind of an argument, that it is through the remaking and the rethinking of everyday life that a possible, communism can be reimagined. This seems to me the moment of important foreclosures, and really very deep kinds of possibilities and openings that are, by the mid-30s, really don't exist. And so that heterodox Marxism, I think that history of it really has to be rewritten in a very, very different way, with very different figures. And, everybody, including Ambedkar, is deeply uncomfortable with that heterodox possibility. Right?
I'll just give a very brief answer, because I think I saw a couple of other people want to ask questions. So this is sort of really vulgarly brief, which is that I don't think that, there was a line drawn very, very early on in the Constituent Assembly as to, or the constitution making process, as to which opinions cannot be even tolerated. And so you see this mostly in the civil liberties debates, because, for example, the preventive detention provision in the Constitution came through the Rowlatt Acts, against specifically against which Congress has Satyagraha. So it's not like something vaguely came through colonial, right? And so this is, of course, a question. And, Somnath Lahiri, who was the only communist member, later left of the reorganization, said that while he's in the Assembly, his house is being searched. People have this list of people, socialists of the house, being searched. And Patel, one of the things he says that, it seems to me the freedom you want to have is the freedom to take down the state. And that's a freedom I think should be repressed, he says. I mean, if you're saying it's repression, it should be repressed, right? And so there is a very clear argument is that, look, we are going to give you all this expansive, beautiful thing called the parliament and thing. If you don't use it, we'll come down on you really, really hard, right? And so that there's a very clear, and so the other thing to remember on the people outside question is the only major political group not in the assembly were the socialists, right? So because the Congress Socialists left, and then the JP wanted to come back in, they were allowed in. And so the only major group, actually, and remember, these are not small groups because they are the second biggest electoral winners in the first election in the 50s. So you can think right away. They have a pretty big social base, but they're not there. So certain kinds of arguments, and they talk about socialism, talk about Red Revolution, remember Soviet Union, of course, and China next door. So there's a whole thing about that's something that is absolutely not okay. Everything else we can still have a chat about, but this is not okay. And if that happens, we'll retain the police. And so, the administration and police always goes hand in hand. No? Like this, not. So you need that as well. Yeah. Sorry.
Police consent coercion.
Yeah.
Okay. Who are some of the? Would you raise your hand? You saw some people.
Yeah. I think Ajanta and someone else as well.
Okay. Yeah.
This is not really a question, it's more a comment. I was sort of struck listening to Sandipto and Anu about the sort of parallels in the use of comparative methodology by both constitutionalism and anti-caste thought. So for both, there's a need to think comparatively in order to be able to draw certain kinds of commensurations, but then also to recognize the limits of those commensurations, right? So caste and class, caste and race, when it comes to anti-caste thought. And then when you were talking about, this sort of technical exercise of fishing for tactics everywhere, right? And coming back to sort of to constitute a machinery of government, right? So this sort of comparative method comes out really clearly in both. And the other way that the comparison seems to work is in how one understands the relationship between the social and the political. So when it comes to constitutionalism, the real fear is of the social in excess of the political. Right? So the sort of political machinery has to somehow figure out a way to encompass, right, the excesses of the social. Right? And the excesses of the social, it was interesting to me that there are two things that are sort of identified as the threat of extra constitutionalism. Right? One is revolution, but the other is totalitarianism, sort of the presidential form of power, right, where the executive is acts as a kind of absolute force. So both of these are seen as sort of, I'm not sure if the second is the social, but there's a sort of excess of constitutionalism that has to be reined in, right? And then for you, I mean, there's this constant need to point to de-abstraction. Right? There's an excess of the everyday, of lived experience that can't be contained by categories of
The categories, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's an excess of the categories. This is not a question. I was just sort of struck by the parallel.
Can I? Sorry. Yeah. This is something just reminded me quickly because I mean, there's this point I was making about when the comparative thing or the way that they went around looking at different constitutions, looking for strategies. They go talk to which works, doesn't works, and so forth. Remind me of there's two different. So there's there's histories of the French Revolution and the two this of the. I don't want to overdo this whole idle type revolution administration thing, but just because time's short. There is the French and both the French and the October Revolution, so Union. You see these moments, right? When the revolutionary moment is not some people sitting in a room calmly figuring out things. The French Revolution is example after example in the Constituent Assembly. People entering, often some of the cities or one of the districts will send representatives who will come and give speeches and shout at the members and sort of force them to do. And same in the October Revolution, it's really amazing. So once when sort of, the Soviets are telling people like, you should wait a little bit, provisional government, and then one of the workers sort of hold them by the collar and says, take power when it's offered to you, right? And so there's this kind of pushing about, don't try to think to, there's a kind of the force of the popular movement of which you're part of, the moment is part of, sort of pushes you towards sort of these resolutions of, and bringing up new ways of like, creating this new social and political order. Precisely opposed to this form, where you sort of, you study well, you're good students, and you're exceptional students, actually, these guys, some of them. And you really take your time figuring out all the, the nitty-gritties. And so that's what I was trying to say, of this administrative, so that's the comparative thing for me is important precisely because I think in a real revolution, the more the revolution the moment becomes, less do you have that scope of doing that. Saying like, how can we build this thing which is, and let's learn from experience kind of thing. There's no experience to learn from. There's this, there's a kind of a groundswell which pushes you towards the thing. I mean, this is maybe a bit too theological, but I mean, just to give a sense of the comparison. Yeah.
Yes, and I'll talk to you later. Ajanta. But yeah, there was.
Yeah.
So, if you look at the kind of the way that the Constitution worked, especially around partition, around citizenship, around preventive detention, around a variety of things that we see, it is very much in sync with the Mahasabha position in practice. So, if you think of Barrett's position on the Constitution as a practiced Constitution rather than the letter of the Constitution, what we have is quite essentially a Hindu Mahasabha Constitution as much as an Ambedkar and an Indian Constitution. And if you think about the Telangana, the Sundarlal Committee on violence, he talks quite clearly about how it was by an organized Hindu group which had been mobilized after the war, or sort of from demobilized army soldiers engaged in systematic violence. So that somehow is just not really brought out enough, I think. I'm not just wondering.
No. Just to say, this is the academic cop-out answer that it's in the book sort of thing, but honestly it is actually. There's some of this discussion. the thing I was talking about, there's a whole thing on civil liberties, which has actually, I talk about, so there's the other side, right? So here I was more interested in talking about what are the ways in which they try to sort of bring in or incorporate democratic voices, but there's a whole side of repression. And on a lot of the stuff, also on property, on the power of local, so what do you do with local social power? And to what extent you crush it, not crush it. So the federalism debate actually through Patel. So yes, so I mean that's a bad answer, but that's the answer. Yes, so I do take these things absolutely seriously in terms of I think there's a pretty strong argument to be made that Munshi is another person, right? Not just Mukherjee. Mukherjee is there and he says some things. That Munshi is really the guy who drives a lot of things very far on property, especially on the civil liberties questions. And so
He's the guy they sent to Hyderabad.
Yes.
Oh yeah, okay.
Right, and I mean in terms of Hyderabad, of course, I mean the Arya Samaj and the Hindu Mahasabha, are central to this story, and they are being sponsored and funded and encouraged by people like Munshi and Patel and other congressmen. And Mahasabha is sitting within the Congress during this whole period.
Yeah.
And you see that break maybe comes more explicitly in the 1950s, but at this point they're all sitting
in the Congress,
whether it's the UP Congress or the Congress as the party as a whole. So I think that's something we should keep in mind.
So can I just ask a follow-up question? Sorry, so then what does that tell us about inventiveness? When you have inventiveness stuck into the 19th century in terms of political identity reforms, and now finding expression in different forms of takeover, then where do you sort of draw the line between the constitutional event and what came before and after, over a century before and after?
If I can add to that a bit, so what's
Yes. I was just, yeah. Yes.
And also, I think that there is an answer in all of this. The point you were making about the quiet space, right? second, if you look at the first five-year plan document, and you look at Nehru's remarks regarding what kind of space the planning commission should be, it is also supposed to be a quiet space, and it also is supposed to hover well above
Politics as
politics.
such,
And it is also one in which you draw components from a variety of different, as you said, parts of the machine, that also is put together through parts of the machine. So it is something that is specific about places such as India, which both have to refer back to revolutionary moments which they have not themselves experienced in order to derive out of them a constitution, as well as other constitutional moments broadly conceived, which are not just about the constitution, but constitution with perhaps the Hegelian sense of the settlement of power, temporary as it is. And here, if you look at Samadar's emergence of this subject, he makes a very good critique of the kind of constitutionalism which is supposed to both close down and reorient the flow of politics in a particular direction. And since Ajay brought up the issue of excess, the absolute impossibility even to predict what forms of excesses the constitution itself will later on
And I think in a sense the Hindu Mahasabha question, and I think Ajay is right to say that it's deeply connected to the question of partition and how we're to understand that, right? And so it is a compact, let's not even call it a constitution at this point in time. If this is a political compromise or a compact, then it is indeed the question of the religious or the spiritual and the question of the economy that are bracketed or are managed through this political process, somewhat successful for 10 to 15 years thereafter. But they're kind of constantly haunting the outside of the political as such, right? And they keep recurring in different ways. So the question of, the economy, the fact that you cannot institute land reform, produces a crisis, as does the fact that the Mahasabha is haunting this conversation all the way through. And I mean, Ambedkar in that sense really is a minority voice, because in a sense, other Dalit leaders at this point in time have capitulated in some sense to what is a broad, it's not a Hindu Mahasabha project per se, but it's the notion of recreating a broad Hindu unity. And certainly his own participation in the Hindu Code Bill then becomes extremely fraught, right? How do you disaggregate the kind of transformation he wants to bring about through Hindu law, while also, challenging the ways in which the Mahasabha project of creating Hindu unity at this moment of partition has been somewhat successful, including and especially with, it seems to me, Dalit leaders. So it is really a very fraught moment, and I think you're right to say that this is a kind of subterranean political history that's haunting the moment of constitution making, if that's what I'm hearing you saying.
Could I just add on to that?
Yeah.
A question about the Mahasabha. I mean, in 2014, this is a question I think we were all asking. It's like, oh, okay, is this actually what India was the whole time? Is this sort of majoritarianism actually built in from the beginning in certain ways? And there was a whole sort of overt silencing about this. Patel's demands that Muslims actually just shut up. And if they want to talk, then they go to Pakistan,
That's
right?
right.
He does say that.
You can't
actually.
ride two horses at once.
right.
Even Maulana Azad saying actually Muslims should not be a political category anymore. After 1947, we need to go back to being a religious category, right? And this is a sort of, in some ways, we can question whether this majoritarianism is there, essential to the democratic project right from the outset. So yes, I think that's a crucial element.
I was actually struck by your comment, what was Patel's, the ultimate paramountcy of popular interest.
Right, yeah.
And, the constant right to mobilize extra political force, right? And you talked about it as him conscripting this kind of vigilante violence into the political.
Right.
And I wondered about that. Is it to sort of rename it as the political, or is it to say, or is it necessary to keep it outside in a sense? That's what makes it legitimate. It's supposed to be this kind of anarchic expression, right, of the popular.
Right, but he's seeking to sort of then internalize that and consolidate it in some way, or to close it up, right? That's the sort of eventful nature of it. It's sort of over now. It's this sort of burst of expression of this, and now we can sort of institutionalize that, right? That comes what comes after the event. But I think by calling it a revolution, this is sort of naming it as political and as sort of foundational as such, right? And that's what I think that's the general point. And I was going to, and he wasn't necessarily discouraging of these mobilizations elsewhere or at other times. Patel, and that's why I call him a sort of Maoist in some ways. You see state power, then actually unleash the people rather than seek to temper them. But it's only of a certain type. Right? And again, this could point back to the sort of majoritarian aspect of.
It's also a question of sort of, what are the consequences of exacerbating agonism within the domain of the social,
Right.
as opposed to exacerbating antagonism within the space of politics as such, right? And that constant back and forth is precisely, it seems to me, what you're talking about.
Alf?
Okay, so I have a broad, sweeping Barrington Moore question for all three of you.
I love to.
It's not a sort of origins question, it's actually a question derived from the other interesting injustice, where he speaks about historically suppressed opportunities. And the case that he speaks to there is, of course, the German Revolution and its quelling, and the notion that there are, in sort of process of modern nation building, there are these historically suppressed opportunities where things could have gone very differently and could have become something very different. And so I guess the question is, does it make sense to speak of historically suppressed opportunities in the making of what became India's post-colonial democracy? Or is there a cut-off moment when it doesn't make sense anymore, when things were foreclosed and what the nation would become was in a sense set, or at least there was such a strong path dependency that it doesn't make sense anymore to even think along those lines. So hopelessly broad, vague, and sweeping. But
Sandipto, did you want to say
Sure,
something?
it requires long sweeping answers, which we don't have time for, but I will just notion to one, I think, absolutely it's open, I think, and a lot of the sort of, the action is in the ability of the left parties to mobilize. On what terms, how? I think a lot of this happens between 35 and 60. And because if you look at this constitutional structure, there is space here, if you're creating a powerful administrative body, if you're letting open some form of participatory inclusion in there, it's not a lot, but so it's not everything. It won't be a revolution, but a lot there to play with, right? And there's a lot of scope there, which is something I think my answer to the earlier question also, this is why I don't think Hindu Mahasabha is that important in the constitution, is because they are not the main threat to Congress. And Congress knows that. Gandhi knows that. Everybody knows that. The main threat to Congress on the left, which is my hypothesis as to why Gandhi chooses Nehru and not Patel. You need to cover your left flank, the right flank, right? And so there is a set of, counterfactuals in which a different sort of organizational strategy, perhaps more if in terms of Nehru breaking out with the left and organizing like something different kind of a left organization, which comes about, one a bit more looking at the peasantry rather than the workers. I mean, this is of course in the realm of complete speculation, but a lot was there in the terms of ability for a strong oppositional force, coherent oppositional force, representative oppositional force, which can have sort of layers, which can speak all the way down the body of the state, on the left, and party of the left in the traditional sense of parties, and which never really appears. And that's I would say that was the path in which within even the present constitutional structure, a different path could have gone there.
He wanted to hear this, that.
Really? I had no idea, but this is in the realm of pure speculation we are now, so there we are.
Again, of course there's foreclosures as well as openings.
Absolutely.
I think that's what I'll say. I think we also, I think the power and force of the left, I think, can be exaggerated, and I think a lot of academics like to look back and see like, oh yeah, these are the guys we really like, but actually in some ways they weren't as, they had not as much potential as perhaps we like to ascribe to them. And I think that points to a sort of wider question, and this is why the question I wanted to ask you, Anu, of why Marx, in some ways, the categories of class or even interest as such are not as essential to democracy in India as we make them out to be. And that's been one of the, I think, analytical sort of problems, is why, Nehru and Ambedkar, all these other guys thought, okay, eventually we can get to a point where we can have a democratic system based around representation of interests. But we're not there yet, and I don't think India has gotten to that point. Maybe with Charan Singh and so on and so forth, but even that was a sort of, contingent sort of maybe in the 1970s, Mrs. Gandhi, the sort of the idea of class interests and that sort of thing, but has proven to be a not very sort of useful way to understand democratic politics in India. Right? So I think it's something we should think about more broadly.
I mean, I would take a different kind of pass on this because I think it's also a question of at what level of either conversation or analysis do you want to be asking this question? I mean, certainly one can, I suppose, think the counterfactual, and indeed there is a lot of nostalgia and political nostalgia for precisely what could have been, and I think there could have been many otherwises. But I think the more fundamental question, and this is also going back to your question, Sunil, is to what extent are we both kind of using categories that have a kind of universal analytical purchase and seeking to, in some sense, provincialize them? I'll use that term. And in what ways is this a project of actually thinking from the ground up in terms of generating categories? This also comes back, I think, Ajanta, to your question of comparison, right? So comparison both in terms of kind of equivalence across difference, but if one is actually going to think through social specificity, then one also has to engage in that kind of radical empiricism in order to actually, put together a different order of systematicity that makes sense. And so I would say that you're kind of asking that question, right? So if we use the categories we're given in order to ask the question in the way that you've posed it, indeed, yes, there are many otherwises, and one could think from any particular region about where that goes. But it seems to me that if one is both sort of within those categories but is trying to do something different with them, then the question actually becomes, what do we do with the story we have? And then what counts as a moment of rupture or revolution? So it's again, this is a cop-out. I think you said it's a cop-out. It's a certain kind of cop-out, but I think it's also a very important question of method, right? And so I don't know how one would answer that, but it does seem to me, though, going back to why Marx, I don't think that we can think the 20th century without Marx. I believe this that Marxism as a form of thought is the practice of newness. It produces newness in the world, precisely because it's able to constellate, in some sense, around this question of the deferral of equality and the manner in which it produces a kind of analytics for thinking the project of inequality, social and otherwise. But clearly that's also a question of reading, right?
But all these guys are also thinking themselves through Marx. But I mean,
sure.
but in a certain respect, like, you had a concern about the universal and the particular, but isn't that Ambedkar's point, is that India cannot be subsumed into the universal, that it is particular, and that these sort of analyses don't actually work?
Sure, but that doesn't mean you can be without them, no? I mean, he is the great, the question of mass intellectuality, if I can come back to that, right. Beginning with Foulé, you think, Du Bois, etc., that project of mass intellectuality is to lay claim to the universal, right? I mean, Du Bois sort of saying, I don't know the Negro spiritual, but I sure know my Greek, if you think in Souls of Black Folk, right. Or Ambedkar's kind of extraordinary efforts to really think within universal history. So that's the kind of project of subaltern political thought, if you will, that has to do this. But okay, Pamela says stop.
Yes, it's lunchtime, so thank you very much.